Hello and welcome to Proto-Germanic Rivalistics. Our topic today is stress placement, stress being the relative emphasis a syllable has in a phonological word as opposed to other syllables. Stress placement in Proto-Germanic seems relatively straightforward. There are as usual attested exceptions to several of the things that will be mentioned here, and there are also diverging opinions on certain matters that you might encounter in the literature. But on the whole, I at least don't believe that anything in the following will be considered controversial or widely contested. As we are approaching Proto-Germanic stress from a revivalistic perspective, I have not felt the need to cover the various opinions regarding possible secondary stress in derivational morphemes or declensional endings. Those discussions can come across as somewhat vague and speculative, but should you want to know a little more about what's been said about that, then you might want to have a look in Bennett 1972 or listen to Sandel 2020. At its core, Proto-Germanic stress is morphologically determined. We can equally say that the primary or main stress of the phonological word falls on the first root morpheme, or that it falls on the first stem initial syllable. It's the same thing no matter how you prefer to word it. Several small lakes of ink have likely been spilled over how to define a word, a lot of it very interesting and some perhaps less so, but most of that won't be a concern of ours today. We'll just make as simple a distinction as we can between what can be called phonological or prosodical words on the one hand and grammatical words on the other. If you want to read more about phonological and grammatical words as used here, you can do so in Volume 2, Chapter 10 of R.M.W. Dixon's Basic Linguistic Theory from 2010. On a side note, you can't go wrong with reading anything by Dixon. It's some of the best work in linguistics theories out there. For us, the most common case will be that the phonological word and the grammatical word coincide. We will gradually approach the difference between these two by beginning with cases where we don't have to think about it, and work ourselves towards elements that cannot carry stress. And then I believe it will fall into place by itself. Firstly, we'll bring up a few simplexes that just carry a primary stress. Simplex just means it's not a compound. Secondly, we'll consider compounds with both a primary and a secondary stress. Thirdly, we'll mention quasi-compounds, for which the same applies. And then, with English not being my first language, and me thus not having any feeling whatsoever for what sounds archaic, ridiculous, or pretentious, fourthly, we'll meet with unstressed reduplication syllables. And fifthly, and finally, we'll take a gander at unstressed clitics. When we're done with that, we can wrap it up, as we'll probably have covered the more important things of what we need to know about stress in revived Proto-Germanic. Most often we have a simplex without any prefixes or clitics attached to it, and in this case the phonological word and the grammatical word will coincide. On screen you can see the examples fots, foot, blewas, blue, and darknadi, meaning he, she, it becomes darker. Here morphemes are separated with hyphens and the roots are written in small caps. The last morpheme in each example is a declensional ending. Everything before that makes up the stem. That is the root together with any derivational morphemes. It's not always this straightforward in practice, and you may or may not wonder why az isn't singled out as the ending here in blewas. The answer to that is that it depends, but we'll have to save that for another day. As is common practice, primary stress is here marked orthographically with an acute accent mark. Compounds are words that are composed of more than one stem. English orthography is not a role model when it comes to how to write compounds. For example, dragonfly, role model, and rose-tinted are all compounds even though they are written differently. In other languages, all compounds might be written as dragonfly is in English, and that's how we do it in reconstructed Proto-Germanic. In a Proto-Germanic compound, the root morpheme of the first member carry the primary stress, and that of the last member will carry a somewhat weaker secondary stress. On screen, we now see the examples ertakundas, an adjective meaning of earthly descent, literally earthborn, and awithaxio, meaning lizard, more literally along the lines of reptile badger. Secondary stress is here, as is also common practice, marked with a grave accent mark. When talking about compounds, I do so in terms of the first member, and instead of saying the second member, I speak of the last member. As far as I know, it seems unlikely that Proto-Germanic allowed compounds with more than two members. Though rare, triple compounds are tested in Old High German and Old Low German / Old Saxon, and if you want to know more about that, you can read about these in Carr 1939. I'm not sure if modern German or Swedish has an upper limit on compound members as long as it's comprehensible. A Swedish example often said in jest is flaggstångsknoppsputsare gesäll, which I believe translates into flagpole butt cleaning journeyman. The story behind that professional title goes that way back in days of yore, sometime between the rise of the rotary dial and the fall of the audio cassette tape, someone supposedly were in a dispute with the yellow pages. Multi-member compounds are quite handy, and today longer compounds are also quite typically Germanic. For revived Proto-Germanic, I see no reason why we should restrain ourselves to two-member compounds. I certainly don't, and if I need a triple or quadruple compound, I'll just make one. I wouldn't encourage anyone to adopt the artificial excessiveness of compounds in classical Sanskrit. Monster compounds with 15 or 25 members might be interpretable at a first reading if you have mastered a language like a demon, but for most of us mortals they can be quite opaque even in our native language. Words with one or more prefixes and compounds, where one of the members is still quite or almost recognizable as an adjective or noun, but is being used very much like a prefix or suffix, are here and there called quasi-compounds, and you can see a few examples of these on screen now. These are unslepagas, sleepless, syngronis, evergreen, abrakaldas, extremely cold, abrahaitas, extremely hot, steupabarna, stepchild, steupamoder, stepmother, wisadomas, wisdom, seukadomas, sickness. With one exception, primary and secondary stress here falls out just as in ordinary compounds. The root of the first member will carry the primary stress, and the root of the last member will carry the secondary stress. Should you have more than one prefix, the primary stress will predictably still fall on the first or outermost one. The one exception is the prefix ga, which is always unstressed, as in gasmithia, piece of jewelry. On a side note, two abbreviations that are good to know when it comes to compounds are IFC and IBC. IFC stands for infine compositi, which means at the end of a compound, and IBC stands for in the beginning of a compound. I'm sure you can encounter the Latin abbreviation IIC for the latter as well. Reduplication is something we encounter when we study Gothic, and only traces of it can be gleaned from the other old Germanic languages. We can bring back our old examples gretana, to cry, skaithana, to separate, and to those we add slepana, to sleep, just to show a case with Werner's law doing its thing when voicing an onset. It's the difference in the onset of the stem initial syllable in the last of our examples here, that between slepana, to sleep, and seslepund, they slept, which tells us that the reduplication syllables were unstressed, at least in the beginning. The Gothic corpus isn't completely uniform in this regard, and there are attestations both with and without this voicing, so presumably it was being leveled out. We can encounter other opinions in the literature. Bennett, 1972, writes that primary stress fell on the reduplication syllable, but as Marchand, 1975, writes in an overall entertaining review of the whole volume, quote, "He fails to tell us how he knows the accents he places on Gothic words," end quote. I at least believe that Bennett's view is a minority one and not something that has gained much traction. Mind though that I don't want to dissuade you from reading Bennett. If you want to read as much as you can of what has been written about Proto-Germanic stress, then Bennett will of course be on the list. In Proto-Germanic we encounter elements called Clitics. Clitics cannot carry stress by themselves at all, and therefore they must attach themselves to other grammatical words which can, and so to speak, sponge on their stress. Enclitics attach themselves to the end of something else, while proclitics attach themselves in front of something else. Assuming for Proto-Germanic what we can see in Gothic, this means that exciting things, such as enclitics attaching themselves behind proclitics, attaching themselves in front of a stem, can happen. In Proto-Germanic, we possibly, perhaps, maybe have something along the lines of 3 kinds of clitics. It's just a preliminary assessment from my spare time observations. And I want to stress perhaps, because not only can one come to different conclusions when analyzing these elements, linguistics as a subject also suffers to some extent from terminological confusion exacerbated by vacuous technobabble, and generally speaking, the study of old Germanic languages lags somewhat behind field linguistics, both in terms of grammaticography and sharpness of grammatical analyses. Of course, if you are a student, that's good news, because it means that there are plenty of things to investigate should the grammar of old Germanic languages be your interest. While not trying to sound too deterring, finding an environment that actually realizes this might not be as easy as coming up with something to write about. That there is a difference between making a trivial observation regarding the phonemic structure of a morpheme, or quote-unquote describing it in the most superficial sense, and to actually figuring out its function and meaning, that is, doing actual, fundamental and intellectually demanding linguistic research, isn't something that everyone has absorbed, an active academic career spanning several decades notwithstanding. Back to our possibly, perhaps, maybe 3 types of clitics in Proto-Germanic. Firstly, we have enclitic particles that are their own grammatical words, such as the by now familiar question particle u, as well as enclitic pronouns. An example in use can be mogodezo drinkana, can you two drink? I'm using a middle dot here to mark the boundary between the enclitic and its host. Secondly, we have enclitic particles in, for example, pronominal word formation, which modify the meaning of the word they attach to. That's likely almost the same thing as derivational morphemes appearing outside of declensional endings. An example of this can be huna, which I suspect we can gloss as a non-specific indefinite particle. From einas, one, we can derive einas huna, anyone. And no matter how many sips of water I'm taking here, I seem unable to uncreak my voice. Thirdly, we have what we mostly are used to calling verbal prefixes or preverbs, but which we perhaps might as well lump with the clitics as proclitics. I'd forgotten about that suggestion until I started browsing in Göring 2023, but Bennett 1972 also calls them proclitics or preverb proclitics. It seems to make sense, so let's go with that for now. Remember that we mustn't cling to a certain grammatical analysis out of old habit, or because it's the first one we were taught, or because it's the one that we at some point came up with ourselves, as this is something that quite assuredly will prevent us from developing our understanding of the subject. Whether we call a morpheme a prefix or a proclitic isn't important in itself. What's important is that we try to find the analysis which to our current understanding describes what we see in the most insightful way and in terms that are most likely to be widely understood among our fellow linguists. As we grow in knowledge and experience, we should always be prepared to revise our previous assumptions. Once more back to our Clitics. To save time, I'm just going to clunk together our example of a proclitic with one with Clitics to show one of those exciting things I alluded to earlier, just so you can get a taste of what kind of fun monstrosities of phonological words we can form in Proto-Germanic. On screen you can now see a glossed back projection straight out of the Gothic Bible, found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 23. In the final phonological word here, gauchoaseweed, meaning if he could now see anything, we have 3 grammatical words merged into one phonological. The little dot below U here is just my personal way to mark hiatus, and we'll get back to that when we come to orthography. First, we have a grammatical predicate, not to be confused with a logical one, gaseweed, which is here discontinuous and made up of the telic proclitic ga, the stem seu, and the third person past singular idealis ending id. In between the telic proclitic ga and the stem we find the enclitic question particle u, that has attached itself to ga, which in turn is followed by the enclitic indefinite non-subject pronoun hua, that has attached itself to u. As neither of these amazing little goodies can carry stress, the main stress must and will in this case fall on the 4th syllable, which is where we find our root or stem initial syllable. And by now the distinction between phonological words and grammatical words has also become apparent to us. Let's sum up what we've looked at today as we continue to ramble through the Proto-Germanic garden of prosody. Proto-Germanic stress is morphologically determined. In a simplex, the root morpheme will carry the primary stress. In a compound, the root of the last member will carry a somewhat weaker secondary stress. To quasi-compounds we count prefix nominals and compounds with members that aren't quite completely prefixes or suffixes, but are still used in compounds as if they were. Quasi-compounds are stressed just like ordinary compounds. Reduplication syllables were, at least early on, unstressed. Clitics are always unstressed. Clitics attach themselves to the end of something else, while proclitics attach themselves in front of something else. If we have clitics that are themselves grammatical words, such as the question particle u, and enclitic pronouns like the indefinite non-subject hua, we end up with a phonological word consisting of more than one grammatical. Strings of clitics is quite typical for old Indo-European languages, including Gothic, and if you ask me, it's something we should embrace, experiment and have really fun with in revived Proto-Germanic. This also happens in English, but one of the many unfortunate drawbacks with English orthography is that it hides this, but you can look it up if you're interested. Regarding my own habits, when I read revived Proto-Germanic aloud, I never stress reduplication syllables or proclitics/verbal prefixes, and I at least try to avoid placing any secondary stress on derivational suffixes or declensional endings in longer words. If I didn't try, it would be there all the time, and everything I said would get a very Swedish accent. I believe we've now covered my notes on stress in Proto-Germanic. As always, if you have any comments or suggestions, please consider joining us on Discord. Everyone is welcome regardless of background and previous familiarity with the subject. Until next time, be well.